Welcome to the Red Stories. It inspires me if you subscribe and like, maybe another comment. Thank you, thank you. How would you deal with an ex that simply cannot accept that you've moved on from them? Well, some people don't have it easy, like our next OP. Discovered my, now ex, wife's affair the day she was admitted into the hospital. Now years later, she can't accept my engagement to my fiancé. If there was ever a prize for the most horrible way to learn of your significant other's affair, I would probably win it and be in its Hall of Fame. Like so many people in this sub, I suddenly found myself as a member of a club that nobody ever wants to be part of. I will never forget the sound of my ex-sister-in-law's voice, as she kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over on the phone while I drove home from a week-long business trip. I was confused and had absolutely no idea what she meant, but only after I managed to calm her down somewhat did she inform me that my wife was in the hospital and that I needed to hurry home. My mind went into overdrive as I tried to get more information as well as not crash while I began speeding to get there faster. The only thing she told me is that it was an assault, then cut the call, and wouldn't answer when I tried to call her again. So what do you think? I would love to hear your opinions in the comments below, and just as a reminder, if you're interested in supporting the channel further, feel free to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, or even share it with somebody you think might enjoy it. All of this helps out immensely, and with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and see you guys in the next one. A bit of background. My ex and I met in our mid-20s. It was through a mutual friend at a barbecue. At first, she seemed almost too good to be true. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, but she was also shy and introverted. It took a while for us to officially date, but once it happened, I was over the moon. When we first tried to get intimate, she suddenly started crying. I should have taken this as a bad sign. I freaked out and thought it was something I did, but she apologized the next day and told me she was triggered. As it turns out, 2 years before meeting me, she was in a long-term relationship with a guy that was abusive, emotionally, physically, and mentally. He would degrade her during their moments of intimacy, then apologize afterward. She had a flashback but reassured me that it had nothing to do with me, so we took things slow as she was still in therapy. It was tough, but because I loved her, I believed that once we got over this, it would make our relationship stronger, and for a while, it honestly appeared that way. Fast forward another year, and we'd gotten engaged. Our first-time intimacy also happened during this stage. I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a house for us courtesy of an inheritance from my late uncle. Things were going great, and I seriously suggested we plant a peach tree, important for later on, to signify new beginnings, and she was all for it. We were wedded not long after that, and quite frankly, it was absolutely amazing. Of course, we had our normal ups and downs like every married couple, but I considered us more lucky because she always made it a point to never go to bed upset with each other. She would always gently point out if I did anything to upset her. Sometime later, life basically happened, and I was promoted at my job. It meant more pay, but it also meant I would be traveling more for work conferences and business meetings. I noticed she'd been getting down a lot more and wasn't being as intimate as before. She would keep her phone close to her and even stop gently addressing things that upset her. I tried to talk to her about it, but she'd assured me that she was fine, and this was a phase she was going through. Having no reason to not trust her, I let it go. She would sometimes go to her sister's place and spend the night, telling me she just needed a bit of girl time with her sister. The day I got that fateful phone call was the day she was meant to be keeping her sister company again. I remember rushing into the hospital, barely breathing, and frantically asking about my wife when the world's most understanding and patient police officer sat me down to explain what happened. He told me he was a friend of my sister-in-law, and he happened to respond to a domestic disturbance call. He arrived on the scene to find a couple fighting. The supposed boyfriend was on top of the female, punching her, and she was screaming, trying to scratch him. This didn't make any sense to me because 1, this had nothing to do with my wife because we're married, and 2, literally everyone who knew my wife knew she wouldn't do that. He gave me a knowing look and placed his hand on my shoulder, then told me to be very calm because said girlfriend was actually my wife. If it weren't for the severity of the situation, I would have laughed in his face, but something in the way he said everything made me believe him. I was then ushered in by a nurse to see my wife, and what greeted me, to this day, I still can hardly find the words to describe it. I just stood there for what seemed like an eternity, then a doctor came in and explained her injuries to me. Her jaw was slightly fractured, her left eye was completely swollen shut, and there was massive bruising covering half of her face, as well as 3 broken ribs. Then the doctor dropped another bomb and told me she was pregnant. I still couldn't understand how this happened, and then I caught sight of her sister. She at first tried to avoid me, but at the persuasion of her police officer friend, she told me what she knew. It turns out my wife's ex had gotten in contact with her 5 months ago. He was doing this redemption pyramid step thing where he would apologize to people he had wronged in order to clear his karma. Anyone else's BS meter going crazy right now. They began talking more, then he convinced her to meet up for coffee and show her he was a changed man. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced, coupled with the fact that he appeared changed now. It soon developed into an emotional affair. My wife approached her sister for advice, who told her to take things slow and just get it out of her system if she needed to, which then led to a physical affair 3 months later. She actually told my wife that she should at least make peace with her ex in whatever form it may be, and even offered to cover for my wife once in a while. My sister-in-law was in tears at this point, and kept apologizing to me that she didn't know about the abuse, as my wife never told anyone other than me and her therapist at the time about it. I was numb. I just couldn't feel anything, and was absolutely dumbfounded by my wife's actions. When my wife finally woke up, I was there, and she burst into tears upon seeing me. I spent the following months in zombie flight mode. There was individual counseling for her as well as marriage counseling for us, at the strong urging of her family. In counseling, she was surprisingly forthcoming about how it happened, and how she absolutely hated herself for causing me pain. She mentioned how at one point, on her way home from his place, she actually fantasized about driving into the river because she smelled like him and didn't want his scent to corrupt me. However, that made sense. She said she tried to end it, but was too weak, and only after learning that she was pregnant did it actually wake her up and make her realize that any further contact with this man was toxic to not only her, but the unborn child as well. Hence, she went to end things in person for good when he snapped on her. She became a shell of herself and developed a phobia for any other males but me. At one point, she couldn't even use the bathroom at night unless I was holding her hand. Sad, right? After the baby was born, a son, by the way, we got a paternity test and he was mine. But the more time I spent with her, the more I realized I didn't hate my wife. I actually loathed her. I couldn't see the woman I married, but instead saw his leftovers each time I looked at her. I decided to leave because I was afraid I'd do something I'd regret and be exactly like her abusive ex. She begged me not to leave and even made the ridiculous offer of giving me a hall pass as well as slapping her if I wanted to. I knew at this point I had to get out. She was actually very generous during the divorce. She moved back into her parents' house and signed a very well thought-out co-parenting plan issued by the courts. Moving forward 3 years later, and I meet my now fiancé by chance. I was in a bookstore with a buddy of mine, and we were discussing Egyptian mythology when this beautiful woman approached me to correct me on my pronunciations of the Egyptian gods and cities. Needless to say, I was immensely impressed by not only her understanding, but also by the fact that she is Egyptian herself. We exchanged numbers, which eventually led us to dating. When I finally proposed to her, it was actually in front of the peach tree I had planted years ago. I got down on one knee, but before I got my answer, she ran into the house and then came out with a ring as well. Turns out she was actually planning on proposing herself because she was madly in love with me, and she didn't want any other woman to have me. My son, in all his sweet childlike innocence, told his mother what happened, because he was present when it happened. My ex literally showed up that night in the rain, yelling about how could I propose to her, my fiancé, that my son would never love her, and that we should just get back together. I was in absolute shock. I hadn't seen her behave this way since the affair. My fiancé took my son to his room and gently shut the door, but not before looking at my ex as if she were something out of a mental ward. This seemed to set her off even more, and she had a mental breakdown, screaming that I couldn't leave her to be with some foreign woman. She made the entire scene so dramatic that even my son cried. I eventually had to call her father to come to take her back home. She's now been blowing up my phone and social media, accusing my fiancé of being a homewrecker, and that I was breaking our son's heart by going through with the marriage. Her family is actually split in this. Some say I should have given her a second chance because it was clear she was assaulted, and others want me to put my foot down and set a restraining order against her.